Good morning, everyone. We have about 1 minute till we get started. Let everybody log in.
We have about 3 hours for this one, right, Amanda?
-2 of that, and then we'll be. It is 9 o'clock on the dot, so we will get started. I'm Amanda, the communication specialist at the New York State LTAP Center, and today we have Phil Spiezio from the Washington County, no, not safety officer, public. Where are you
Yeah,
working?
no, senior safety officer is good, or just a safety guy, Amanda. That's
The
perfect.
safety guy. Phil, the safety guy.
Yeah, there you go. Perfect.
So thank you for coming to today's webinar on worker safety. We will be using the Zoom poll, so no need to access poll EV today. The chat has been disabled, but if you'd like to send Phil or Jody or myself a question, you can put it in the Q&A. So on that note, we will get started. Our first poll is I work for. So we have town, county, city or village, state or federal, tribal, private, or the weekend. Right, it looks like got a good mix today of town, county, city, village, state or federal, private. Nobody was honest and said they worked for the weekend. All right, next poll we have is my job is. So please pick one: administrative, highway super, or DPW commissioner, engineer, field crew, board member, or none of the above. If it's none of the above, if you can throw it in the Q&A, just so we can get a little hint of what you do. So it looks like good mix again. We have administration, highway, engineer, field crew. So far, I don't see none of the aboves. And second to last question. Oh, we have a regional rail coordinator. Nice. So the next question is years in current position. Less than 1 month, less than a year, 1 to 2 years, 3 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years, 11 to 20 years, and 20 years plus. So again, it looks like we have a good mix of new and seasoned, as we call them. And then last question, we're going to throw it in the Q&A, is where are you from? So what county are you in? What town are you in? Where are you zooming in from today? I don't have a poll for that one.
I like that season comment, Amanda, turning 60 this year. It's like, okay. Not a bad word, I guess.
Let's see, we have Tompkins County, Wayne County, Suffolk County, Broome County, Jefferson County, Watertown, town of Ogden and Monroe, Western New York, Clinton Corners, Dutchess County, city of Saratoga, town of North Harmony, Chautauqua County. So we got a good mix of all over the state. Awesome. And I will turn it over to Phil. I'll be popping in and out with your Zoom polls.
Super. Thanks, Amanda. So we're jumping right into worker safety. So this is a bit of a blend. Appreciate the invite again. So we've done a few of these now. Talked about some toolbox and tailgate safeties, training type stuff. We've talked about the why of safety, some cultural stuff attached to that. We did some hierarchy of hazard control stuff in the past, and exactly once we find a hazard out, how do we mitigate that hazard? Today, we're going to break down some larger safety programs that affect everybody. Everybody has some sort of a program, a policy, or what we'll talk about today, a system for that task. So my name is Phil Spiezio with Washington County. The safety guy, the salesperson guy, whatever, but somehow trying to affect change so that everybody has a chance to go home whole every day. I'm also the president of the Empire State Safety Association, ESSA. Check us out if you haven't yet, but we've got a lot of members throughout New York State. We started just before COVID, and we're still building, but everything's good. We got another spring conference coming up in April, and the website for ESSA is empirestatesafety.com. You may find that to be a good resource for some of your safety and health things. All right, so let's jump right in. Take a look at something I'm kind of calling the grassroots safety approach. But when you start looking at safety and that sort of thing, you've heard me talk in years past about the hazards of what we do, right? What are we doing? What are those hazards associated with that? And then what are our control measures? What are we doing to minimize that risk, right? We can't get rid of all risk, but we can certainly minimize it. And you've talked about the JHAs or the JSAs, job safety hazard analysis type stuff, right? And all right, what are our hazards? What are our control measures? And if you do a really good job with those type of documents, with that system, that's pretty much your whole program. So today we're branching out a little bit more, and we're talking about systems, we're talking about training, and we're talking about the culture. Those are the three main ingredients when you're talking about, all right, how do we improve our safety and health here at our department, our organization, our team, and things like that. So breaking it down a bit, the systems is the engineering control, it's the procedure, it's the guideline, it's some sort of hazard assessment along with that analysis and control. So first and foremost, do we have to do the job? All right, we do have to do the job. What's the system? What are we agreeing upon that we're going to use each and every time when we do this task or perform this job that we have to do? So the project. So first and foremost, the engineering controls, like we've covered in the past, right? That's separating the hazard from us. That's the best control measure. Whenever we can separate the hazard from us, the hazard really can't hurt us at that point, as long as we've done a good job with the guarding, we've done a good job with whatever we're doing to control that hazard and isolate it from us. Then the procedures, or the guidelines, things of that nature, that starts to depend on us. That depends on the individuals to follow that procedure. But if we involve people doing the work, we're more apt to have build a good procedure and then follow that procedure and guidelines. And the job hazard assessment, analysis, and control, that's something that we're doing all the time, is like, okay, what do we do? What are the hazards associated with what we do? And what are those control measures? So do you think you could improve your safety systems when you start looking at this, and I've defined a system as this? What do you think your systems are like? And do you think you can improve them?
Answers are rolling in. We have a lot of yeses and some need our help. Thankfully, no no's.
Great, super. Thanks, Amanda. Okay, yeah. So, okay, so a good bunch of us agree that our systems, right, could use improving. So that's great. Likewise here, in the different organizations that I work with, right, systems, that's a common thing, is that, hey, what can we do to improve the system? Because oftentimes when something happens and our prevention measures fail and we have an incident, we have an injury, we have something happen, a near miss, right? Oftentimes we look at the person, and, many times it's not necessarily, or certainly not always, or all the person to blame. It's what's the system? How do we develop the system to allow our people to be successful? And that's something we have to look at. So good, breaking down the systems a bit. Let's take a look at the training side of things. So the trainings have to be designed with the system in mind. So you develop the system, and then their training has to go along with that system. All right, are we training our people effectively, efficiently? Do we know that they have a good sense of knowledge, with the system, right? Or are we training them in a different way so that the system is difficult or convoluted or things like that? So once we set the systems up, we have to identify the training, the type of training, how do we do the training, whether it's through mentorship, whether it's through on-the-job training, whether it's a combination, whether it's toolbox talks, or whether it's bringing them in for like a safety day type thing where you're doing a lot of training, either in classroom or field work. But whatever training works for you in that particular system, that's what you want to try to do. But you want it to be effective, you want it to be efficient, you want it to be measurable, meaning that you need to see, do the people understand, does our team understand the training, the system, and the process that we're using to follow that? So with that in mind, what type of training does your team do?
So this is a short answer question. I know you guys weren't ready for a test today. You can just type in, then we'll share all the results.
There's no wrong answers though, Amanda.
No.
There's a lot of different types of training out there. So I'm interested in seeing, what's some main training or some types of systems or trainings that we're doing. I expect to see some toolbox talks and safety tailgate talks and things like that, but
We have work zone traffic control, tailgate
okay.
talks, safety days and in-person trainings, yearly safety, offsite and online, bucket truck,
Mm-hmm.
tool time meetings.
Okay, super good. So we're doing lots of different types of training out there, which is what I expected. So, all right, now let's Chuck. We've talked about systems, we've talked about training. Now let's talk about that culture a little bit. And most people have heard me talk about the culture before. Lots of times, your safety people, your safety professionals, the people going out championing safety, regardless of their position, right? We're not necessarily teaching you anything new. You already know what you're doing. What we're trying to do is get people to think things through as they're doing it so that they can minimize the risk, right? Because we're always in a hurry. We're always wanting to get something done, production. So we have systems, we have training, and that third grassroots safety element is the culture. It's probably the most important too, although it's more like a three-legged stool that you have to have all three parts, the systems, the training, and the culture. And if they're not all equal legs, the three-legged stool tips over. So I like to refer to it as you need to have a balance with that. What is the culture of your team, your organization, right? Attitude, right? It's the collective of the team members. So it's all your team members collected together, but it's their individual attitudes. So it's the addition of those, or unfortunately, in some instances, it's the subtraction of those attitudes that lead up to the culture of your team, your organization. How do you improve culture? One of the big things, and you may have heard me talk about this before, is the trust. The trust is probably the single most important thing in all of this. It's the foundation. It allows things so that you can do things to the best of your ability, but a lack of trust hurts in every avenue as well. So building trust, influencing trust, right? It takes a fair amount of time to build somebody's trust, but it takes a very, very short period of time to lose somebody's trust. So that combined with leadership and good communication really has a way in creating a positive culture, whether it's a work culture, a safety culture, doing the job right the first time, that sort of thing. It's really important. So with this all in mind, what is your culture like? What is your work culture like?
Answers are falling in. We
Great.
got a lot of strong and a lot of a lot of needs work.
Okay. All right. Yep. Sounds good. Now, okay, so kind of split up there, right? Couple bad, a few bad. And then otherwise it's just about 50-50 strong and needs a bit of work. So, wrapping up the culture a little bit. Thanks for the input. With this picture is pretty close to me. There's two individuals that are no longer with us, and this picture was taken shortly after COVID. It was within the last couple, 3 years, that sort of thing, or when COVID was something that we were dealing with every day. So two of these individuals have passed from cancer. And one of the things I like to think about when we're talking about culture and we're talking about the team members of that such is remember that, live each day the way that you want to be remembered is something that you might want to consider. So each and every day, right, you're thinking about things and how to treat people right, or what's the right thing to do and things like that. And if you keep in mind, and I know it's difficult in the heat of the moment in production and things don't go that well. But if you think a little bit about those relationships, right, it all boils down to relationships, whether it's work relationships, family relationships, friend relationships, things of that nature. It boils down to that is if you can keep in your mind how you want those people to view you or remember you or think of you, because you never know when life's going to change, drastically, throw you a curveball, and things like that. So just keep that in mind. And I think if you think about your effect, right, and you never want to underestimate the words or actions that you have and how that affects others. You just keep that in your mind as you're working through problems and conflicts and things like that. So a little bit about culture. So we talked about the systems, we talked about the training, and we talked about the culture. So jumping into the why of safety a little bit, and we've covered this before in this venue, but if you're not doing it for yourself, do it for the other people that are in your life. And this really boils down to the why of safety, right? I like this sticker. This is something that I'd had on my hard helmet for years, working for Fort Miller in the private sector, but asking me to overlook a simple safety violation would be asking me to compromise my entire attitude toward the value of your life. And that's something to consider, right? Because sometimes you want to give feedback to somebody. It's like, hey, look, go get a taller ladder, or go get the right ladder, or hey, let's move that lead cord so that it's not in the walkway, right? Or that sort of thing, or put your safety glasses on, right? Sometimes we resist telling somebody that because we don't want to offend them. But if you look at it as, hey, we're in this together, someone has to pull that domino out. That's real important. So that's a little bit about the why of safety. So the what is safety, two distinct parts, right? We talked a little bit about this in the past. So the two distinct parts, one is the hazards and the hazard controls, and the other one is the human element side of things. So we talked about this, I believe, the last time a little bit, but these are the two distinct parts of any program. It's the what is safety. If you want to talk about safety and what it is we're going to do, this is what we want to do. First and foremost, okay, what are the hazards and what are our control measures? How do we minimize the risk? And then think a little bit about that human element side. And how do we interact? So what are some hazards that you happen to be exposed to while you're at work?
All right, let's see what hazards you guys are facing every day. We have traffic and falling objects,
Traffic. Yeah.
traffic, more
Yeah.
traffic, slips and falls, and chemicals.
Okay, yep, a little bit of chemical. Slip, trips, and falls are common too in traffic, right? Everybody's in a hurry. Everybody's doing something else but drive out there. So certainly that's one of the hazards that we're always considering each day is that traffic control. And we'll have a slide there later to touch a little bit about that. So the how of safety, right? How do we create the attitude, the culture, the positive attitude? You've heard me talk a little bit, if you've attended any of my other trainings about value and the core value, safety being a core value of not only yourself, but of your organization. and the value is something that you grew up with, right? That's something that's important to you. It's not as easily influenced by outside circumstances as if you were looking at safety as more of a priority. If something's got to get done and safety is just a priority, well, does that priority change because we have to get this job done today type thing? Where if it's a value, yes, you still work to get the job done, of course, but you don't sacrifice safety. So I always like to look at safety being a core value of your organization, and the people in it. And a lot of it is based on that fundamental three elements of trust, leadership, and communication. You know, one of the things being in safety is you have an opportunity to work with a lot of different work groups, a lot of different teams, a lot of different organizations. On the public side, you're working anywhere from, with the sheriffs, corrections, public health, DSS, to DPW, building and grounds, things like that. And, you'd start to see and feel that when you're in an organization or a department or a team, especially the smaller teams, you can walk into a garage and talk with some of the guys. In 10, 15 minutes, you start getting a feel for how that team is. What's the level of trust? What's the level of leadership? What's the level of communication within this work team? And you can really look at the teams that have these fundamental building blocks of trust, leadership, and communication. They're doing the job right the first time. They're not getting hurt, and they're productive. The teams that don't have this so much, that's when there's the bit of problems that start out as campfires and turn into forest fires because we're just not handling as quickly as we probably should have. So think about that and think about your safety, and being sure you've got a good foundation of trust, leadership, and communication. All right, so let's jump into some topics a little bit. We're going to do an overview of some of the things, like I mentioned earlier, that affect everybody. So DPW specific, there's two types of standards that we need to be familiar with. First is the construction standards, and they affect us largely in the field. So our project sites, our road work, things of that nature, we're oftentimes looking at the 29 CFR 1926 OSHA regs. When we're back in the shop and in the yard around the shop and things of that nature, then we got to consider those general industry standards, the 1910, for compliance stuff. And there's also, if you go on the OSHA webpage, there's all kinds of information on there to help you with fact sheets and different things to help you understand the standards. So you're not just reading the standards, which are difficult. I understand. I read them at night before I go to bed every night, but I realize not everybody does that. No, just kidding. But they are a good resource, for you to take a look at. So how familiar are you, with the safety standards?
Looks like only a few other people also read them before they go to bed as well.
Is there a couple that do, Amanda?
We have 3 very. 22 could use a refresher and 2 not at all.
That's great. Wow. All right, so they're out there. Take a look at them. You can get them on the web. You can get them in the books, things of that nature. These are a couple of books we have here in the office, but it's a good resource to take a look at when you develop your systems or you're developing your training for those systems. To take a look at that to make sure we're meeting those things. All right, a little bit on the enforcement side of things. So public sector is enforced by PESH. These OSHA regs largely are the same. So they're enforced by the PESH side for our public sector folks. Private sector folks, the OSHA regs are enforced by OSHA. So there's the federal OSHA in New York State, and then there's the public side for New York State as well. There's also consulting. So whether you're in private sector or you're in public sector, there's a consulting branch on each one of these that is a good resource. So if you're ever looking for some extra help developing a system or providing the training, things of that nature, feel free to reach out to PESH. or the consulting side of OSHA if you're in private sector, and they'll help you out. It's a good resource for sure. All right, so breaking down the topics a little bit, incident reporting. Everybody should have some sort of an incident reporting system to follow, to help people, to guide people into, okay, what do I need for help? I've got an unplanned event that adversely affects work operations. What do we need to do? How do we need to do it? What resources do we need? 911 is emphasized, right? If there's some sort of serious injury, you got an odor of gas, a fire, some sort of hazardous condition, you don't want your system to slow down the call to 911. So be careful about that. Non-related 911 calls, right? Non 911 where it's obvious, okay, I don't need 911, but we had an incident. We want to make sure that that doesn't happen again. What's my first call? Where do I go? What do I do for here for this type of an incident? So with that in mind, how many people have a solid incident reporting system within their team?
We have a bunch of yes, some no, some need some update, some not sure.
Okay.
Mostly
All right.
yes, though.
Okay, so over 60% anyway have some sort of reporting system. A few don't, and then some that need to be updated. So that's a really important system, especially when you're, first of the year, you're starting to revamp things again and things like that. It's always good to take a look at, all right, how do we report incidences here? And has everybody been trained, informed, given an opportunity to be successful in following that incident reporting system? So the injury and illness logs, everyone fills these out to some extent. Public sector, we're talking about the 900s and we're talking about the 900.1s. The 900.1 has to be posted February 1st through April 30th. That's the summary of all injury and illnesses, work-related, that you had in the previous year. Private sector, we're talking about the OSHA 300s and the OSHA 300As. The forms are very, very similar. Just ones are used for the federal OSHA, the private sector, and then the public sector, the 900. The 300A is also a summary page, and that has to be posted from February 1st to April 30th as well. So don't forget, so February 1st, I think, is Thursday. So these things have to be up and posted prior to that and then kept up to April 30th. Hazard communication right to know is a big one. This is the oldest standard. This is the oldest OSHA standard that's out there, and it continues to be the most cited standard. So hitting the highlights, we don't have time to go in detail in all of these topics, but just to hit the general highlights so you can go back and check your system, check and see, okay, do we need to update this system? Do we have everything? Are we training people? Are we doing what we say we're supposed to do? So an inventory of all chemicals, right? You need to have that. Now they're changed, right? They used to be the material safety data sheets or the MSDSs. Now they're called the SDSs. Format 16 sections are all the same wherever you go in the world. You remember the global harmonization change to the HAZCOM right to know that came out in 2015. So a working table of contents define SDSs, right? So you got to have something, right? You have to have the inventory, but then you have to have a way to find these things, and it has to be accessible for each of your team members, regardless of the time of day or night. So keep that in mind when you're developing or you're taking a look at those table of contents to be sure that, okay, do I have all the SDSs and can we actually find them in a need type thing. Labeling is important, right? You got a picture here, container, right? It didn't see a label on it. So it's like, okay, what do we have in here, right? It's a spray type thing. You know, that's important to understand and know. And the labeling has to bring you back to that SDS for that chemical. Proper secondary containers, right? You can't put some chemical into a secondary container and have it break that container down so it starts leaking or things like that. So make sure if you are putting something in a secondary container, it's not only labeled, but it's a suitable container for what you're doing. You know, you can't use food or drink containers or anything like that to put chemicals in. And then adequate training. Are we training our people to follow the system that we have in place for the HAZCOM right to know? And one thing I always recommend here is if you've got some sort of ordering process, writing requisitions or things of that nature, have a box to check on there on whether the SDS is on file or not. And don't order it until you get a chance to review that SDS to make sure it's something that you want to bring into the work environment. Hazard assessments, right? What do you do? What are the hazards associated with what you do? And what are the control measures required to keep you safe? So right here, this is a large part of your entire safety and health program. If you do real good jobs with the hazard assessments, everything else falls into place. And this is something you have to look at is what's the system? I've got to go do this. All right, what's our procedure? What's our system, right? And then we go down through the hierarchy of hazard control here is we talk about, all right, do we have to do it first and foremost, right? Then we talk about engineering controls if we have to, right? Then we talk about safe work practices. And then we talk about training, right? And education. And then finally, we get to PPE, right? That's our last measure. So think about that hierarchy of hazard control when you start looking at your hazard assessments and build a really good system and then do the training, right? Do the training specific to the system so that people understand that system. That's the hazard assessment piece. Large part of our program right there. All right, hazardous energy control or lockout tagout, something else we have to consider, right? It touches all of us. We're talking about front end loaders, right? We're talking about the dump trucks and the dump bodies. We're talking about a lot of different things. We're talking about air compressors in the buildings, any sort of other equipment that we're locking out. We're talking about a hand tool, a powered hand tool, and how do we appropriately lock out and tag out that. So, the basic steps are up here. Regardless of what piece of equipment or machinery you're controlling the hazards with, it's notify all the employees, identify all the potential energy sources, right? And there's lots of them, right? We can list a few, but it's air, hydraulics, water, electricity, there's lots of them. Gravity, right? Weight, if you got a lifted load of any kinds or something's up in the air, you got to make sure that you've got that block, that sort of stuff. Be sure that we have all of those energy sources neutralized, right? Talking about, some of the electrical stuff, right? We have to ground some of that out because a lot of our electrical wiring and systems that we have on our trucks these days will hold electrical energy for a while after you turn off or you isolate the electricity. You have to actually ground it to be sure that there's no potential energy left. Specifically with the voltage. Ensure check that all the energy sources have been neutralized, right? Make sure that when you do this, that, okay, everything is off and check to be sure of that, right? And then be sure, like say you're starting a three-phase motor or something like that, is you want to control the startup when you finish the lockout tag and you go back. So you want to make sure that any motor starts or anything in which you tried to start to be sure that you've got the energy source isolated, that you return that to the neutral or the off position so that when you throw the breaker, when you get ready to start back up again, that doesn't come on automatically, right? You want to still control it with the buttons or how it's designed to start up. So, and then after you've done all that, that's when you remove the guards and begin work. To put something back in service, you're going to follow those basic steps the other way. So that covers, for the most part, any system that you're developing for the loaders, for the trucks, any type of trucks, for the equipment, the machinery, the tools that you have. These are the basic steps, and then you build a system specific to that piece of equipment or machinery. So when you're doing these, you want to be sure that you've covered every major piece of equipment or machinery that you have. If you got 3 dump trucks and they're all the same, then that's all right. You can have the basic program for all 3 of those. But if they're different, which many of them are, you have to have a specific procedure for that individual dump truck or piece of equipment. So take a look at that when you have a chance. Make sure your system covers so that then when you do the training, you do the training per the system. And that's something too that each year, anybody that's an authorized employee, meaning that you allow them to do a hazardous energy control, a lockout, tagout, You have to check to make sure that they know how to follow that system and that you don't have any deficiencies in the system. So once a year, you have to take a look at all your authorized people and have them go through a hazardous energy control, a lockout, tag out. Confined space is another one that typically all of us have some sort of area that in our workspace. And some of the things are like you got a manhole cover out in the yard or some other confined space, right, that doesn't allow for human occupancy all the time. It's not designed for that, but you can get in that space. If you're not going in, and just put a sign on there saying confined space, do not enter, right? Something such as that. Pay special attention to your permit confined spaces, right? Permit required confined spaces. Be sure you've identified these spaces. Now, those of you that work in sewer and water and things like that, you're going to have much more of a program when it comes to permitted required confined spaces and whether you're entering or whether you're not, and identifying all of those hazards, or pay special attention to you bringing in another hazard that confined space, like, you're doing some welding or torching or something else down there. So sign them appropriately on whether you're going in or whether you're not going in. And then if you do have to go in any confined spaces, make sure you develop a good system and then perform the training and make sure that it's effective. The people doing any sort of confined space entry are trained, they're qualified, they understand the system and providing that training for that system. So that's real important when it comes to confined space. Some of us do it more often than others, but it affects all of us a little bit, even if you're just putting signs up saying confined space, do not enter. And then making sure you secure it so people can't go in that space. All right, so trenching. Trenching is another topic that we all do in some way, shape, or form. So remember the types of soil. There's 4 different types, right? From stable rock to class C or type C, right? And it goes less stable as you go on. And then there's requirements for working in that type of soil, right? Most of our soil, you're going either, to type B or type C because it's already previously been excavated. So think about the type of soil and how do you protect yourself from that type of soil. So from a regulatory standpoint, trenches 4 feet or deeper require some sort of safe means of access, egress, and that has to be every 25 feet for as long as the trench is. So every 25 feet at 4 feet or deeper, you have to have some sort of access, safe access or egress. And oftentimes it's a ladder, a job ladder, or things like that. And all the ladders, all of the requirements of the ladder apply here with, a handheld 3 feet above the hole, that sort of thing. So it allows you to get in and out of the hole. And if you think about this, even, a 2.5, 3 feet deep trench, you really should start to think about, all right, how do we get our team members, our employees in this and out of this trench safely? So compliance, it's 4 feet. I would say, hey, if you start digging 2.5 to 3 feet down, you don't want your employees or team members jumping down and trying to, crawl back out. So always make sure you have a safe way of egress or access. The standard does apply for 4 feet, and it also calls for every 25 feet. Trenches 5 feet or deeper, that's when you start requiring a protective system. Probably it's not as easy sometimes, but the sloping is the best way, right? And then just the amount of sloping that you're doing, the angle of repose on your soil is going to be based on the type of soil, right? But oftentimes we're at least 3/4 to 1 from a sloping standpoint, and oftentimes it's 1 to 1. So you start going down, deep or deeper, or 5, 6, 8 feet, you start talking about, all right, how big that hole starts to begin. So that's the trade-off here, is we're working with a hole. We're trying to minimize the impact of oftentimes the roadway. When we go down deep, your hole becomes pretty big, which requires a lot more material coming back in and tamping and things like that. So that's a little bit about the trenching, the sloping, the shoring. And there's also shielding involved, right? You know, for trench boxes and things like that when the application actually is useful and you can use something like that. Now, you start digging deeper than 20 feet, you got to have a PE involved. You got to make sure you get a PE involved and you design that system so that everyone can be safe. So all equipment and spoils at least 2 feet away from the trench edge. That's important. And a competent person. Each day, someone has to inspect the trench. Each day you have that open. Oftentimes, I think in the public works, the DPW world, most of the times we're digging and then putting the trench back, compacting and getting the roadway back open in a day. But each day you have to be sure that someone is inspecting a competent person's inspecting the trench that know a little bit about it. Watch out for seeping water, flowing water, things like that, in changing in conditions. So trenching is one of those topics that you got to be real careful with. The hazard sometimes isn't as identifiable as I think we wish it was. And the impact of people and the injuries that they sustain from a collapse in a trench is very, very significant. So be sure that you've got a good system set in place for whenever you're digging, doing trenching type work. Work zones and flagging. So this goes hand in hand with one of the topics that were thrown out when we were talking about what hazards are we exposed to on a daily basis, right? And the public works, we're working lots of times project sites and road work, project works, you know, we're dealing with an open road and we're dealing with traffic and we're dealing with people that are always in a hurry or oftentimes in a hurry, are dealing with distractions and they're doing everything but drive. So a little bit of stuff on work zones and flagging here is develop a system every time. It doesn't matter how many vehicles, how much traffic the road sees. It plays into it a little bit, but just be sure you have a good system because all it takes is one car, one time for something to happen at one of our project sites. Document the system. So once you develop the system for that project, document it. You know, consider taking photos from different directions and the signage with the photos, where your flagger stations are going to be, things like that. Once you come up with this system for this project site, be sure that you communicate it to all involved. And this means that the trucks coming in, bringing material, that sort of thing. Think about the staging of those vehicles, the staging of the other resources like other equipment, other tools that you need for this project site. Try to keep it on one side of the project site so you don't have things on both sides to allow those drivers coming through the work zone the best line of sight. And a clean, organized project site is generally a safer project site. So do what you can to set your system up so you, again, allow people to be successful. Once you communicate the system, you start to set the system up, right? A rule of thumb here, pretty much every time you set up a work zone, is you get the signs out first, you make sure they're in good system, you get good places, right? You're looking at hills, you're looking at curves in the road, you're looking at line of sight, you're looking at shade versus sun. A lot of factors come into place, but be sure you got the signage out appropriately for what the speed is on the road, and make sure that the motorists, you're giving them every opportunity to see that there's a warning, that there's a job site ahead. And then the flaggers go out. And then last is your equipment and machinery. So remember that signage, flaggers and equipment. And then just like with the hazardous energy control lockout tagout, when you take it down and you finish work for the day, you go in an opposite direction. I always like and I encourage people to drive through the project site once you get everything set up to test the system. Take a drive through, see what the motorists, see what the drivers coming through the work zones see. Sometimes you can catch something and say, oh boy, I didn't notice that. And you can revise that system a bit before you get going. So that's a little bit about work zone and flagging. So work centers and project sites, back to, you know, the garage. but also in the field as well, right? Clean and organized work centers, right? People don't get hurt. They do it right the first time. They know where the stuff is. They're more efficient for sure. Keep in mind the flow of work and material for whatever that is, right? If you're bringing in more resources as you're doing the work, what's the flow? What's the flow of the work? What's the flow of the material? Good proper storage, right? You're putting like stuff with like stuff, the lift and chains with the lift and chains, the straps with the straps, the lead cords with the lead cords, the hand tools with the hand tools, a rhyme or reason for what we're doing. Room to move around. This is something that we struggle with, especially in our DPW garages, right? When we start putting the plows on and the frames and things like that, our area to move within those garages start to diminish. So we have to make sure that we have some sort of room to move around in a safe manner, that sort of thing. So keep that in consideration when you start organizing your garages and things like that. So adequate resources, right? You know, that one of the things I think over the years we're pretty good at is using limited resources to get the job done, to try to keep the tax base, the expense to the tax base down and things like that. But we have to make sure we're utilizing and we do get obtain the resource we really need to do the job right and do the job safely. So I sometimes bring up the duct tape scenario. We're really good at using duct tape to keep the job going and figuring it out, but make sure we have the right resources to allow people to go home whole every day, allow people to be successful by following the systems we have in place. And then the clear means of egress, real important. If something happens, we need to get out of the building. It's real important to be sure that we have a good path out of the building to our accountability area should something happen. Fall protection. This is another one I think sometimes we struggle with a little bit, right? Is our fall protection systems, right? Do we have to climb first and foremost? So, you know, I use the conveyor belt with the grease fitting right at the top of the conveyor belt. You know, maybe we can use an extension and get that grease fitting so we can grease it from the bottom. We don't need to climb, you know, and there's other things we can do sometimes to eliminate the need for climbing. If we have to climb, then the prevention systems are always the better way. So what do we do so that someone can't fall? How do we prevent them from falling? And that's oftentimes when our mid rail or 21-inch mid rail or 42-inch top rail along with the kickboard, if people are working underneath, are going to keep us from falling. There's you know, as long as you're not adding height onto that and using a ladder off the scaffold, that 42-inch top rail, 21-inch mid rail is going to keep you from falling, that sort of thing. So that's an example of a protective system. Correct ladder and ladder usage, right? How many of us go grab a chair when we know we should be getting a ladder or a step stool with a hand grab on it, things like that. So the correct ladder and then using the ladder properly, right? Don't use a step ladder as an extension ladder. Oftentimes the results aren't good when you do that sort of thing. It's designed to be opened up and work as an A-frame step ladder. Use it that way. If you need a straight ladder, an extension ladder, then get that sort of thing. Good climbing techniques, right? A rule of thumbs, keep your belt buckle inside the rails, right? Don't reach too far in either direction, things of that nature. If we do everything we can from a fall prevention standpoint, then we have to start looking at fall protection, right? So, you know, somebody mentioned one of the hazards they have is bucket trucks, right? It doesn't do us a whole lot of good to have a full body harness hooked to a 6-foot lanyard, right? That's going to stretch to 9.5 feet, right? When it does its fall protection, right? When you're falling and now you're in a bucket and you're 10 feet off the ground, right? You know, you have to have that 2-foot lanyard, right? If you got a 6-foot shock absorbing lanyard on, it's going to 9.5 feet when it stretches out. You want to make sure that what you have in place for fall protection is actually going to help you. So every once in a while, I see somebody in a bucket, they're 10 or 12 feet in the air, and they have a 6-foot shock absorbing lanyard on. That's not going to work, right? If you're 6 foot tall or thereabouts, when you go out of the bucket, right, you're more than likely going to hit the ground or whatever before it actually does everything it's supposed to do. So a 2-foot lanyard attached to a proper anchor point in the bucket keeps you in the bucket. So if you're working out of a bucket, you want to make sure you have the harness on, you're hooked to a 2-foot lanyard, which is going to keep you in the bucket. You don't want to go out of the bucket, and it's properly hooked. So real important when it comes to the fall protection standpoint. And proper PPE, again, is last, right, when you talk about this. So often you see the picture here of the person, standing in the bucket doing the Christmas decorations, right? Probably not the safest way, or it isn't necessarily the safest way to minimize risk of doing this, right? Because that person's safety is at the mercy of what? Not only himself, if he leans forward, there's nothing to catch him, but also the operator of the tractor. So a picture that indicates, hey, you know what? There's probably something better we can do to minimize risk with this sort of system, with this sort of process. All right, something else that we have to deal with, all of us, right, in New York State, right, with harassment and workplace violence. I'm not sure what's going on. The picture's blurry, so there's a lot of movement here. I'm not so sure they're smiling, but I thought it was a good picture to use. But maintain a good work culture, right? That trust, the leadership, and communication. Deal with things when they're a campfire, not when they're a forest fire, right? From a harassment standpoint, from a violence in a workplace prevention standpoint, you got to do assessments, right? You got to make sure those assessments are thorough, and they're looking at the hazards that you have. Is the lighting good in the parking lot? Is, what do we have for systems from locks and doors and fobs and cameras and things like that, right? The systems have to be fair and consistent, right? And treat people with dignity and respect, right? That's what we're trying to do here. We want to give everybody the opportunity to work in that environment, that they're treated fairly, consistency, with the dignity and respect that they deserve, right? Effective training, that's really important, right? Every year, right, you have to do training. We have to do training, compliance training, or thorough training, and making sure they understand our system for prevention of sexual harassment or reporting of sexual harassment and what we do should something happen each year. So be sure that training is effective per the system that you put in place. Early reporting is something you really want to do here, based on trust, based on leadership, based on communication and how you handle these things. You can get the reporting early, so you're dealing with something that's a campfire and not a forest fire. Last but certainly not least, is treat people right. PPE, right? PPE is on the bottom of that hierarchy, hazard control, but it's real important here. So last measure, minimizing risk, right? Based on your assessments, again, make sure when you provide PPE, there's a proper fit, and the training has to talk about use, care, maintenance, and the limitations of any PPE that you're putting in place here. Again, that's the last measure. We're talking about engineering controls. We're talking about safe work practices. We're talking about training. And then last but not least, we're talking about PPE. Respirators. Some of us use different types of respirators and different applications. If you are using respirators from a voluntary standpoint, be sure that you cover the Appendix D training that's in the 1910-134 for the OSHA respirator training. If you're talking about mandatory use of training, your system needs physicals, fit tests, training again on use, care, maintenance, and limitations of that, talking about the end of use and things like that. So mandatory usage of respirators kicks in the physicals, the fit testing, and things like that. So be sure you have some sort of system in place for the respirators. Got some other topics that we've put up here, including guarding, right? Be sure that, the best way when I'm looking at a guarding assessment, I walk around and take a look at tools, equipment, things like that. I look at something and say, if I wanted to hurt myself, could I? And if the guard isn't effective enough so that if I wanted to hurt myself, if I still could, take a look at the guarding. Probably needs to be improved a little bit. Talk about our tools and equipment, right? Safe use. If we're finding tools and equipment that are modified, that should be telling us something that, oh, wait a minute, we may not have the correct tool or piece of equipment that we need for this application. Ergonomics, right? Fitting the job to the worker, right? It's not fitting the worker to the job, it's fitting the job to the worker. So make sure when you start looking at the ergonomic aspects of it, can we get something off the floor? Do we have to work on the floor, right? Is there a way we can get it up and off so that our body mechanics are good? Slip, trips, and falls. Somebody mentioned something about this with the hazards. You know, it's typically our number one reason for injury every single year. So do what we can to work together to minimize those slip, trips, and falls. The electrical infrastructure is something else. It's common for me to go in an office environment in a DPW garage and see, you know, maybe a multi-strip outlet connected to another multi-strip outlet because there's not enough outlets in the room, things like that. So be very careful and mindful of your electrical infrastructure. If you're tripping breakers, if things happening in your ground fault circuit interrupters tripping and things like that, take a look at that. There's more than likely something that's not quite correct. And in your vehicles and machinery, right? Make sure that you have good systems in place, especially for backing, right? Goal is a common acronym for a backing procedure, get out and look. But really make sure when you're starting to operate vehicles and machinery, especially when you're mixing people in, that you have good systems and then the training to back those systems. And then the culture will take care of itself with that trust, leadership, and communication things. So talking a little bit about what we've went through today, build great systems, develop good people. Build great systems, develop good people. So take a look at that. When something happens and the prevention measures fail somehow and we have some sort of incident, look at the system first. Is the system good? Is it something we've used? Have we trained the people on the system? Do they understand how to follow the system, right? And then look at that culture side, which would be the people side, right? Did we do enough? What's going on here? What's the culture like? Why didn't somebody choose to follow this system? Right? What's inherently with the culture? Is there a problem here? That sort of thing. Was the training not effective, or did we miss something with the system? Right? With a foundation of trust, some leadership, right? Some really good leadership. And excellent communication where you can build the systems and you can develop the people, right? Because we're all doing more now with less people. I don't believe any of us are probably doing less with more. It's all about trying to do more with less. And with that, that starts to put a little bit of strain on that safety as your core value of your organization. A little bit about the core value. Encourage people to think things through the dominoes effect. And talking about, hey, this is what we're trying to do each and every day. Is everybody goes home whole every day, hopefully maybe even a bit better shape than they came to work. And this picture is a picture of a gentleman using a step ladder to do some work on I think it's a ventilation system of some sort. But the story behind the picture is the morning he was using a 5-gallon bucket. So I stopped and talked to him and I said, geez, you know, there's a better way. You really shouldn't be using a 5-gallon bucket, that sort of thing. He was great. That afternoon, I came back through and sure enough, he's using a step ladder. So kind of a bit of a success story that, you know, when you do talk to somebody that might be doing more risk or taking more risk than what the job actually, you know, calls for, is stop and talk to them and say, hey, look, there might be a better way of doing this. And the dominoes, right? We're all in this together. Safety isn't the responsibility of the foreman or the superintendent or whoever it is. It's part of everybody's job. And I always like to refer to the dominoes. We all play dominoes, right? You line the dominoes up and you make the path so that you hit the first domino, the last domino falls, right? You know, I refer to that last domino as being that event, that fatality, that serious injury, that incident that was unplanned that adversely affect our work operation. Any one of us could pull one of those dominoes out and the last domino is never going to fall. So that's something to think about. If you don't pull that domino out, who's going to? So think a little bit about that with your safety and safety being a core value. All right, so back to why the safety, right? Why the safety? Well, you know, every incident is a number, and every number is a life, and that life has a story behind it. And the impact on others, you know, I've been called to help with different fatalities. Um, I'm a volunteer firefighter in my other side of life, things like that. I was on the scene of a fire in which someone lost their life. The impact of those events on people are everlasting. So think about that. If you're willing to take the risk for yourself, then you know what? Think about the effect of that risk that you're taking. And if something was to happen, what's the effect on others, right? And maybe you might think a little bit more about that and say, you know what, today it's not worth taking that risk. Stop, look, take a look at it. What can we do to minimize the risk? Work together. Because you know what, we all get away with things, right? Until we don't get away with things. So think a little bit about that and the effect on others when you're starting to take a look and or maybe taking a bit more risk than what it deserves. So back, the general theme of this today, as you can see, I took a whole bunch of different topics that we all interface with on a daily basis. And we set it up with this, grassroots system or grassroots safety approach, which is built on systems, right? And building those good quality systems, looking at that, revising them, making sure they're good systems to minimize risk, do the training per the systems that you built, right? Do the training effectively, whether toolbox talks, classroom training, on the job training, mentorship, things like that. We're all doing more with less people. Let's keep those people safe and let's teach them right from the get-go, right from the start. And then that culture, right? Remember how you want to be remembered and try to live each day and build those relationships about how you'd like to be remembered at the end of the day. And culture is that collective attitude, or and in some instances, the subtraction of the attitudes within the team that you have. So take a look at systems, take a look at training, and take a look at the culture of your individuals and your team to do everything you can to minimize risk. So with that, Amanda, I think we're right about on time.
Right, hit the nail right on the head, right at 10
Okay.
o'clock. Thank you again, Phil, for
Yeah.
presenting today. And thank you guys for joining us. And we will see you next Tuesday. Have
Thanks,
a good
Amanda.
one.
Have a great day.
You too.